I say that mindfulness is a state of mind where you are in the present moment, not the past and not the future, but the present moment on purpose with an attitude of non-judgment.
You actually witnessed a death
Yeah.
of your boss during a meeting, and he wasn't just your boss, he was a mentor, he was someone very close to you, he helped shape who you were. How much did mindfulness help you?
I didn't necessarily lose a boss, I gained a spiritual advisor. Mindfulness and meditation, particularly meditation, is your space to shut down your outside environment so that you can actually get some clarity about what is going on in your thoughts. Once you get that.
Welcome to the Illuminating Wisdom podcast. I'm your host, Marcia Narayan Weldon, and I'm a lawyer, business strategist, corporate trainer, and executive coach. Each week, I'm going to bring you my favorite entrepreneurs, thought leaders, legal professionals, and other coaches who will inspire, educate, and empower you. Shawnta, I'm really happy to have you here today because you and I are pretty similar. You've got a compliance, CPA, audit background. Well, I don't have the CPA because I'm not a numbers person, but I've got the legal compliance audit background, yet we both like mindfulness. And a lot of the people I coach are in the professional services firms. They don't get the mindfulness, the meditation, it's woo, they don't understand it. And what's so special about you is that you actually started a mindfulness program in a bank. So let's start off right away, because one of the things I want to do with the podcast is get people to have actionable things that they can do right away. So somebody's listening to this and saying, my employer will never go for this. How did you get into mindfulness? Why is it important to you? And more importantly, how did you convince a bank full of bankers and CPAs and professional services people that this is going to be beneficial for them?
Yeah, thank you first and foremost for having me on your show today, Marcia. And you're right. I did not. My background is not the traditional mindfulness instructor. I actually started my career in public accounting and went on to spend the last 20 years or so, as you said, in compliance and governance. I even worked a couple years in technology, but it was actually that technology role where I experienced what I like to call my belonging crisis. So I had been working for this Fortune 100 bank for about 5 years and was promoted into this role as VP transformation leader, which basically meant that I was responsible for automating manual processes. And, that environment coupled with, my own personal life, changes. I was a new mom. My son was at the time maybe 2 years old. And I was in a romantic relationship with my son's father that was falling apart. And then on top of that, I'm in this new role where, quite frankly, it was a very toxic environment. I experienced a lot of microaggressions. This was the first time in my 20-year career that I was ever the only ethnic minority on a team. Not that that bothered me, but, feeling the toxicity of the culture put me in a position where I kind of lost myself a little bit. I was extremely depressed. I was extremely not engaged, and to give you some color in terms of what I was experiencing, I had a colleague ask me at dinner in front of my entire team, had I gone to college? I actually have a CPA, I have an MBA, I'm highly credentialed. At that time, I had a background in audit technology and audit software. So I was appalled, and I was very embarrassed, and I was all the things, right, that we of color, people of color and women that we think when we're in experiences like this. And I also jumped to a lot of conclusions and made a lot of assumptions, but I didn't realize it at the time that I was doing those things because I did not have awareness. I did not have awareness because I was not meditating. But around that time, I kept seeing mindfulness come up. It would come up in conversation. It would come up. I would see it in, on books and, come up in these interesting ways to the point where I started to kind of pay attention to it. And I remember watching a documentary. It was a Black woman, sharing her experience with mindfulness from the transformative perspective. And I really related to what she was saying because she kind of looked like me. She was from,
Right.
I think from LA. So, sort of an inner city girl like me. I'm originally from Detroit. She, was like everyday people. She was a hairdresser. She, I saw so much of myself in her. And when she described her experience with meditation and how transformative it was, this was the first time that I actually saw myself as being a part of this world. Prior to this, I thought it was for everyone else. I thought it was for people of a different faith, people of a different race, and certainly not people with quantitative backgrounds like mine. But she really sparked my curiosity, and so that was what led me, down the rabbit hole of learning, down a rabbit hole of curiosity, which included within a 6 month time frame, reading a ton of books, watching a lot of documentaries, and developing a personal practice where I was meditating every day for 20 minutes a day, listening to like binaural sounds and,
Hmm.
doing all of these things that I was finally understanding through data, how they worked. Because that was why I didn't really relate to mindfulness before, in addition to there not being a lot of practitioners that look like me and sound like me. But also, no one was talking about the data. They were just talking about, sort of a feeling, but I was starting to learn about the neuroscience and learn about
Hmm.
how corporations were using it to gain a competitive advantage. Whether you agree or disagree with that, is
Right.
not really the point. But they were using it, and I'm talking Silicon Valley, I'm talking your Salesforce.coms, your Amazons. They were using this as a tool to unlock potential in their employees. And so within 6 months, developed my own practice, and things in my toxic environment started to change. I was starting to actually develop more empathy for my teammates and develop more empathy and compassion for even my stakeholders. I mean, I'm being charged to
Hmm.
automate processes, and that was
Right.
eliciting fear in them. And I didn't see it that way until I slowed down and started to develop the ability to see something outside of myself. And so it changed my career. It changed my relationships. And this was like, right before COVID. So,
Right.
beginning of 2020, I am operating on level 10 in the courage space,
Right.
because mindfulness and meditation sort of shrinks your amygdala and grows your prefrontal cortex. So I was in a state of a neurological state of courage. And I actually reached out to the company's chief HR officer and said, hey, I have some ideas on how we can improve workplace culture with mindfulness. And he listened to me. And then COVID hit. And I got a chance to really develop programming to really just be in service of my coworkers, because I'm in a state of compassion as well. And started a community that started with like 5 employees like me that really wanted to just learn more. I started talking and telling my story, and the community eventually grew from 5 employees to 500. And
Wow.
after about a year, I launched my company, Mindful Culture Creators, and to date, I've taught thousands of people across the globe techniques that help them understand how they can apply this in everyday life, for everyday people.
So there's 15 podcasts that can come from that one paragraph, right? But let's break it down a little bit, right? So you talked about, the amygdala, which is the part of our brain that kind of governs fear. You talked about the
Mhm.
prefrontal cortex, which is basically the CEO of the brain, and we really need it for functioning, for judgment, for focus, etc. Explain, briefly how mindfulness practice actually helps that. I actually just right before this podcast, I just finished doing a presentation for the Florida bar for a bunch of lawyers, and lawyers need to know all the science. So I literally
Yep.
just had this conversation about 45 minutes ago. And sometimes people don't recognize
Yep.
because they hear we should meditate, we should be mindful. And they think they have to be in a lotus flower like this and have all the stuff I have behind me with Buddhas and
Hmm.
candles and Palo Santo. But it doesn't have to be that. So talk about how it actually affects the brain, because I think for some of the people listening, they need to hear that. I think,
Yeah. No.
you don't know how the light bulb works and you turn on the light and it
Mhm.
comes on, you don't care. You don't know
Yep.
how, airplanes fly through the sky, but you get on. But I think
Mhm.
sometimes when it comes to mindfulness and things like that, people need to know the why and the how. So
Yes.
briefly, how does it affect the brain?
Yeah, no, great question. I was one of those people. I needed to know the why and the how in order for me
Hmm.
to make a decision to include it in my life. And there are many ways that it affects our bodies. But the easiest way that I can explain it is that our brain is always changing. There's a process called neuroplasticity, whereby everything that we do, we're creating a new, sort of a new environment in our brain, particularly when you do things on a ritualistic basis. And so meditation has been proven through science. And I mean, so many studies. Like, I think I heard a statistic that there are like over 400 studies that sort of validate the neuroscience behind meditation and mindfulness, particularly mindfulness based stress reduction, MBSR style mindfulness. But most of the research that I see kind of sums it up to the parts of the brain that we just mentioned, the amygdala, which is like your fear management system.
Hmm.
The body is not, we are not, fear in and of itself is not a bad thing, right? You need to be afraid in order for you to survive, right? And
Right.
the analogy that I like to use is without fear, like if I just eliminated all neurological, presence of fear in my body, then I could perhaps get up, go outside, walk in the middle of the street, and just stand there and allow a car to hit me because I'm not afraid of the sensation of a car hitting my body, right?
Right.
And even if I survive that, right, that is my amygdala not actually operating in the way that it should with an intention to protect me. However, because of our DNA, because of our stress, because of so many factors, sometimes the amygdala is thickened to a size where our fear sort of overtakes our decision making. And so
Hmm.
mindfulness and meditation has been proven through science to sort of change the amygdala. They almost kind of have an inverse relationship. So it makes the amygdala smaller and it makes the prefrontal cortex, as you said, which is the CEO and decision making center of the brain. This is the part of the brain that controls our ability to know that that's a bad decision to get up and go
Right.
outside and stand in front of a car and allow it to hit us. So, when you meditate, you're creating the environment that sharpens your decision making and sort of puts fear management in a state where you're just more effective. It's not eliminating the fear, but it's putting you in a state where you're not allowing the fear to actually stop you from doing things. Because that amygdala is what they call in psychology your fight, flight, or freeze response. And so many
Hmm.
times, maybe we choose to freeze. We choose to do absolutely nothing. And when you think about that in regards to just our everyday actions, us pursuing our dreams, us pursuing our goals, us doing things like this, speaking in front of people and sharing our
Hmm.
personal stories, being our authentic selves, right? So often, the reason we choose, particularly as people of color or as women, we choose to not be our authentic selves is because we are afraid that that version of us is not accepted. And so that fear management system is a bit overactive and our
Right.
decision making is being clouded by that. Mindfulness and meditation for me and for so many others puts me in a state where the things that I used to be afraid of, I'm just not afraid of them because my decision making part of my brain is saying that you're safe. And so, I've completely transformed my career because of
Right.
meditation. If you get outside of the neuroscience and just say, what has been my experience? Well, I went from having a career as a corporate compliance leader to now having my own business where I just came back from Indianapolis yesterday where I led a talk on mindful belonging in front of about 200 people, sharing that my personal belonging crisis, where I shared very vulnerable parts of myself. I can tell you for a fact that I was not doing that before I started practicing mindfulness. I was not sharing my story and sharing my vulnerability in front of people simply because I was afraid. Now that I
Right.
have the neuroscience to support me actually pursuing my dreams, I'm actually taking action and my life is so much more improved. My stress is reduced. I've lost weight. My skin is more clear. I mean, I could go on and on and on about the physical benefits and people see me. They literally see me and
Right.
say, you look different, like, and I have to maybe do a
Right.
before and after picture to really show, like, I have physically changed, I have
Hmm.
emotionally changed, and it all has to do with the neuroscience of the change in my brain.
So you mentioned something earlier about seeing somebody who looked like you. You and I
Hmm.
met last year at a spiritual retreat in Peru. And interestingly, it was led by a Black woman. She's actually the one who certified me in mindfulness and Reiki and other things. And it was, I think, important for many of the people there to be at a spiritual retreat with someone who looked like them. In the mindfulness community, though, there sometimes can be a backlash. At some point, we need people who are culturally competent and aware, which does not mean that a Black female is the only person who could talk to other Black females. But there is a benefit to that. But I want to go to the flip side, the concept of what's called McMindfulness, right? There's a
Yeah.
book about this. The thought that there are people who are culturally appropriating the concept of mindfulness, which comes from from many traditions. But the book with mindfulness talks really about there are people who are not adhering to the Buddhist traditions, and not necessarily that book, but people who comment on the book have
Yep.
made comments that in fact they're taking everything away. And interestingly, one of my other spiritual teachers, we used to chant every Saturday with a guru in Malaysia, and he talks about yoga. And he said, he's from India, but he lives in Malaysia. And he says, in the US and the West, you guys look at yoga as exercise. You're missing everything else. You're missing the importance of the thinking, of the nature, of the rest, of the chanting, of all of the other parts of the sadhana, of all the ways that you live your life. Whereas you guys are focusing on getting the perfect downward dog or the perfect, sun salutation. How is that different than, and I agree with him, right? How is that different from the concept of how many of us in the West have kind of taken mindfulness like namaste, let's do it, goddess vibes, meditation vibes? How do you avoid uh, that when you package mindfulness and meditation? And is this really a valid concern?
Yeah, I love that question. And I think it's a very important topic because, in my perspective, is very different. And so here's my perspective. Mindfulness is a word that, in my opinion, is defined. When I summarize all the various definitions of what mindfulness is, I say that mindfulness is a state of mind where you are in the present moment, not the past and not the future, but the present moment on purpose with an attitude of non-judgment. Now, when you think of it from that perspective, and as someone, I'm a nerd by trade, also. Like anything that I'm
Yeah, we
interested
heard
in.
all those degrees. With all those
Yeah,
degrees, yeah,
yeah.
we
I
figured that
like
out
to
already.
learn, right? Like I am, definitely. I have a growth mindset, and I've always, since I was a child, I've always loved to learn about spirituality. I actually grew up in a African Methodist church, but I went to Catholic school. And I have a lot of exposure to spirituality through family and through travel, and I just like to learn about different ways that people choose to support culture. And what I have learned, in my years, is that mindfulness, maybe they didn't, other cultures maybe didn't use the word mindfulness, right? And that word does sort of have roots in more Hindu and Buddhist tradition. However, the idea of utilizing the present moment to enhance your life and or to tap into spirit, is another way to put it, and another way that other faiths describe what mindfulness is. That is your moment with God or with the universe or whatever you choose to call the higher power. That is not specific to Buddhism. That is an ideology and a belief system that has existed in Native American cultures, in African spirituality, in Mayan and Incan spirituality. And if you think about it, it makes sense because at that time, people they didn't have the technology and the distraction that we have, right? So being in the present moment was their way of life. It was their way of being. And it was a part of their spiritual culture, their spiritual practices as well. So when I think of mindfulness that way, I think of my own upbringing in the Black church, right? And how much mindfulness, maybe not the word mindfulness, but the concept of being in the present moment without judgment, how much that is so much a part of Christianity, how much it was a part of Catholicism, how much it was a part of my African Methodist traditions. And so I say all that to say, Buddhism does not own the present moment, right? The present moment is something that exists for all of us. Now, can corporations and people exploit, right, and use this ideology for benefit that is maybe outside of various spiritual ideologies of, really just using this to, be a better person, to tap into God, to tap into so on and so forth? Of course, right? And that is what we've seen happen in the West with yoga. Yoga is a spiritual practice. Yoga, by definition, means union with source,
Mm-hmm.
right? So yes, we have secular versions of it, and we have trap yoga. I actually like trap yoga. I choose to follow the side of mindfulness that says we accept things as they are. Right, the non-judgment part means if I am practicing mindfulness, regardless of what faith I'm pulling it from, if I am doing it purely, I'm doing it with an attitude of non-judgment, which means that I don't really care, right? Like what people, say in terms of how they choose to describe their experience with mindfulness. I want to teach people, and particularly people of color, how to tap into the present moment because my experience, the experience of others, and so much research supports that when we are intentionally in the present moment, or when we intentionally go to the past, when we appreciate nostalgia, when we intentionally go to the future through visualization,
Mm-hmm.
everything says that when we do things on purpose, we reduce our stress, we reduce our anxiety. There is a medical and a scientific, factor in all of this. And so, what I like to do is be relatable, right? I
Right.
do sometimes, I do sometimes bring in spirituality, depending on my audience. Sometimes I keep it purely academic, depending on my audience, and sometimes I root it in business, depending on my audience. But my goal and intention is always the same: is to help people reduce their suffering and reduce, really reduce their feelings of anxiety. Really use mindfulness as a tool to help people be better, to be better humans. And when you think of it that way, I don't see how you could ever, I don't see how there could be an argument against us using it, to really help people reduce their suffering and free them from concern.
Yep. Right. They say is, pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional, right? And one of the other
Right.
things that people say is that you should detach from the outcome. And so
Yeah.
one of the things I wonder is, can you have too much mindfulness? I'll give you an example. My mother has successfully completed chemotherapy, got a negative PET scan yesterday, thank God. But when she
Oh,
was first diagnosed, I had been spending so much time in the present moment that I didn't do any kind of research until the very last minute. The
yeah.
old me, because like you, I'm a nerd, I am going to watch every possible video. I'm going to look at oncology presentations written for other doctors. I'm going to read everything and would spend months. But I spent so much time like, I'm going to focus on the present moment. I'm going to detach from the outcome. I'm going to let the universe do its thing. That it wasn't until about 2 days before her surgery that I said, oh my God, I don't really know anything about this. So
Yeah.
could somebody actually go overboard in being too much in the present moment, too much detaching from the outcome? You kind of gave the analogy of walking in front of the car because you're not really thinking and you're thinking that I'm
Yep.
always safe. Is there a point when it can go too far?
Yeah, I think mindfulness is really the idea that we're trying to cultivate is awareness, right? And
Hmm.
so what you cultivated was an ability to notice that perhaps you need to do more research, right? And, or perhaps you need to make a better decision. I think that there's a lot of research on, does mindfulness sort of reduce our fight for social justice, right? Because we're really just
Hmm.
accepting things as they are. There is a lot of
Hmm.
criticism against Buddhism as a faith, particularly in the Black community, because of just sort of this ideology that it's not really rooted in actually helping people. It's just kind of rooted in keeping people where they are. I try not to get too caught up in that ideology, right? Because I think that for most of us, that is a concern that we are nowhere near approaching. I think for most of us,
Right.
we are so distracted that, for most of us to be more in the present moment is going to improve our life simply because it's
Absolutely.
going to bring us more focus. And, we have these devices, we have, everything pulling at our attention right now. There is a lot of data to support why we are so unfocused, why anxiety is on the rise, why suicides are on the rise. And I think we are far, far, far away from mindfulness being the cause of any of that. I think we're at the brink on, just really culture, global culture, where we're finally sort of waking up to, what life could be. And that's
Right.
the interesting thing about mindfulness is that, we're in the point where we're shifting as a society. If you
Hmm.
follow astrology, right? I can speak
Hmm.
many languages. So astrology, we're going from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius. And
Right.
there are so many shifts that are happening where, we have this rise in AI and chat GPT, and people are really afraid at what that is going to mean for society. I listened to Jack Cornfield and the CEO of Chat GPT this morning talking about,
Hmm.
can bots have consciousness, right?
Right.
And the reality is, I the people that I relate to, they don't care about that. They care about,
Right.
how can I increase my wealth? How can I reduce
Hmm.
my stress? How can I be more present with my family? How can I,
Right.
attract the love of my life, without feeling, the fear and the pain of the hurt that I experienced, or the sexual trauma that is preventing me from being open and present with my lover, right? Those are the
Right.
things that my audience cares about. And the science and my experience says that mindfulness can help with all of those things. Mindfulness can help you, sort of get out of your monkey mind, right? Your wandering mind, which is everything but the present moment, and get into the present moment so that you can actually get the data that you need to make better decisions. And I also
Yeah.
like to, to kind of close this point out, I like to look at mindfulness as, sort of your computer programmer, right? When a programmer wants to make a change to a program, they shut the computer down, and then they go
Hmm.
in and they make their change, and then they turn the computer back on. Mindfulness and meditation, particularly meditation, is your space to shut down your outside environment so that you can actually get some clarity about what is going on in your thoughts. Once you get that clarity, then you can come out of your experience, your practice, with greater clarity so that you can make better decisions. And I think
Right.
most people need that. They don't necessarily, they're not at the point where they are so zen that they are missing things in life, because the reality is that most people are not zen. They're actually quite stressed.
Yep, absolutely. And it's an important point. When I was just doing the CLE for the lawyers, I was talking about, there is that importance where you have that space to pause, right? Because a lot of lawyers, the reason why lawyers are so stressed, and there are many,
Mm-hmm.
is that number one, if they're litigators, it's an adversarial system. So they're fighting like
Right.
this. If they're deal
Yep.
makers, they're trying to get the deal and there's a competition, right? So lawyers are helping people, but they're often stressed because I can't help Shantae not lose her house, or I can't help Hunter not, deal with his employer, and sometimes lawyers themselves can have this kind of trauma, but they don't like to sit still. And what I try to focus them on is that when you have that pause, when you learn to be aware of the present moment, it's really helpful so that you don't automatically send off that nasty gram to the opposing counsel because you've
Yeah.
just hung up the phone. You're like, I can't believe this, as opposed to sitting there and just saying pause. And another thing is, I try to tell people, especially some of my coaching clients, that to think about what this actually means. Yes, we should focus on the present moment, but how important is this in the present moment? And then also, is this same thing going to be important 5 days from now, 5 weeks from now, 5 months from now, and 5 years from now? If it's not going to be important 5 months from now, then why are you letting it give you the sense of agita? Right. And if
Yeah.
this is this long term kind of, this could be a life and death situation, or it's going to completely change my trajectory, then yeah, maybe you think about it. So, how do you get people who find this need to focus? What are some of the specific things you tell them, especially people of color, right? Because we talked about that a little bit, and in this podcast, I'm going to have a lot of people come in and talk about mindfulness, but everybody's got a different perspective. You talk about microaggressions, you talk about racism, right? And the first thing when we hear, "What you said? Did you go to college? What do you mean
Mhm.
by that?" Right? And you're ready to like go on Instagram. I cannot believe the racist I work with, when in
Yep.
fact there could be something else. So tell me some specific tools that people can think of, first of all, when it comes to being in the present, but also thinking about how to determine whether something is really worth getting hot and bothered about, and how
Yeah.
mindfulness can help that.
Yeah, really one of my signature programs in my offerings is what I call Honor the Pause.
Hmm.
And that is a mantra. It is a way of being. It is a program. It is so much. And what it means is that between a thought and another thought, and between a thought and an action, is a pause. And when we engage that pause, and I'm a risk management person, and what I
Hmm.
find is that when we engage that pause, we minimize the risk of overreaction because we are actually utilizing the pause for observation. Because the
Hmm.
reality is, oftentimes we're reacting to things that we really only need to be observing. And I say that from personal experience, going back to that story where my colleague asked me had I gone to college. Several months later, and this was during the wake of George Floyd in June of 2020, I wrote an open letter to my organization, to I think the whole company, I can't remember who, but I just expressed my experience with social injustice, and my experiences in the corporate workplace with what I felt was cultures that did not represent belonging and inclusion. And I used that example without giving any names. I used that example as an example of my experience, and that colleague actually reached out to me with so much empathy. I mean, he was like, I had no idea. I would, if you're open, if you're not open, I totally understand if you hate my guts, but if you're open, I would love to have a conversation with you. And at that time, I'm about a year into meditating really, really consistently. So I am a different person. My amygdala, my prefrontal cortex, my hippocampus, everything is different now. And so my response was different. And definitely, I would love to have a conversation. And he said the reason that he asked me that question is because he works in a site that primarily has hourly employees that don't have college degrees. And so he got into a habit of asking anyone, instead of asking them, where did they go to college, first asking, did they go to college? And so that was his frame of reference from why he asked me that question. I accepted that, right? I accepted that along with the rest of our conversation. And he later became one of my greatest allies in this role. And he was someone that was very supportive of me in my career, in that role and in future roles. And so I say all that to say, particularly, for those of us that have experienced a lot of trauma, right? That have experienced rather events that lead to trauma, because I'm learning that trauma is not really the event, trauma is the wound. And so
Right.
when we understand that the wound can be healed, right? The event cannot go away. And many times our minds are so caught up in the event that we fail to actually do the work to heal the wound. And so every time we bump it, just like a physical wound, every time you tap it, every time you bump it, it stings. It's a trigger, right? And so for many of us, our trigger response is overreactive, right? And that's
Right.
why, and that is it's not the only, it's not the why, but it is a contributing factor to a lot of the stereotypes that we of people of color have, such as the angry black woman or angry black man
Right.
stereotype. I've lived I'm from Detroit, Michigan. I went to an HBCU, shout out to Hampton University, and I live in Atlanta, Georgia. So I know Black people very, very well. And while we are not a
Right.
monolith, and I don't, purport to speak for all Black people, I can say that I witnessed a lot of overreaction in my life. And a lot of that is simply the result of a wound that has not been healed, right? And again, it doesn't mean that the environments don't have to change. I am one of the biggest proponents of social justice and all of the
Right.
work that needs to do to create greater equality in this world. And in addition to that, the more that we individually work on healing our wounds through tools like mindfulness, therapy, mantras, honoring the pause, actually taking space to observe before you react, we find ourselves with greater peace. And the last thing I'll say about that happened. It's almost like you were watching me this morning, because I received an email I'm working with a vendor, and we've been going back and forth on something that he should have provided me, like a month ago, I feel. And what he sent me this morning was still not what I thought it was, what I thought it should be. And I'm on my phone and I immediately start typing. This is not right. This is the same as this. And
Right.
as I'm kind of scrolling up and looking at the email exchange, I actually realized that I was wrong. It was different. He didn't address everything, but he did address quite a few of the things that I was getting ready to hit send and say, this is completely wrong, right? And so had I just sent that email, had I not paused, because I physically, in addition to pausing from typing, I paused and took a deep breath. Because because I'm present and I'm mindful, I could feel the anxiety rising up in me. I could feel my shoulders tense up. I could feel my stomach tighten. I could feel my breathing patterns change. And I just repeated that mantra to myself, honor your pause. And I took my pause, I put the phone down, I came back, looked at it on the computer versus the phone, was able to bullet point out the things that he needed to continue to correct, put a softer tone on the email, because there's no
Right.
point in being angry at this. If I'm not going to work with him anymore as a vendor, so be it.
Right.
But what is overreacting in this moment going to do when he still owes me
Right.
work? I'd rather him,
Exactly.
rather leave this email with a positive tone and then get
So
my
you can get
finished
your
product,
work back, and
and
then
then I can choose to work with another vendor. It's a lesson learned, right? Now I'm able to see things from a different perspective. I now know I needed a bad experience so that I could recognize it for the next time that I work with a similar vendor and be better prepared to prevent that from happening. So all in all, I say mindfulness and meditation, they're really risk management strategies to help you manage
I
the
love
risk
it.
of overreaction and help you manage the risk of all the various risks that are happening in our lives on a constant basis. We need tools to be able to manage those risks, and mindfulness and meditation are excellent tools to do that.
I love that concept of mindfulness as a risk management strategy. I'm going to appropriate that and I'm going to credit you for that, of course. But here's another thing.
Course
You
coming
talked about
soon.
you talked about trauma, and you went through your own trauma, and I
Yeah,
want to know briefly, how did mindfulness help you? And I know that you actually witnessed a death
yeah.
of your boss during a meeting, and he wasn't just your boss; he was a mentor. He was someone very close to you. He helped shape who you were. How did without going into too much detail, how much did mindfulness help you?
Mm,
And I ask this because I don't realize how mindfulness can be used. There are the U.S. military is teaching mindfulness to people in the armed forces because they deal with trauma on a regular basis. I work and I study with lots of people who are into energy psychology, and they're working with mindfulness and tapping and other kinds of things with people in the Ukraine who are in a state of war. So let's talk about not mindfulness just to be good and not send a bad email, but how did your mindfulness practice briefly help you deal with that trauma?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. And the quick story, is that, or the quick answer to that is that it helped me be prepared, right? And I say that from the perspective, to kind of set the tone for this event. I was actually coming from a meeting about mindfulness and mental health for Black men. And I was joining my one on one with my manager, who was also a Black man. And that meeting started very normally. Like it started a little abnormally because he was a little more harsh on me than he normally was. But that was
Mm-hmm.
totally my fault because I was so ingrained in my work within mindfulness that I was starting to, really sort of disengage from my day job. And that's sometimes what happens when your passions take over your life.
Yes.
And
Right.
he was very supportive. He was very, like, as you mentioned, he was not just my boss. He was my mentor. He was one of my biggest advocates for this work that I was doing side by side with my day job as a corporate compliance leader. But at the same time, my slip was somewhat showing, and he was giving me redirected feedback in the most, diplomatic way that he always did. And then mid sentence, everything just changed. He lost consciousness, and we're on a Zoom. On a Zoom, he's alone, and so immediately I think to myself, I mean, of course, I'm panicking. The fear, my amygdala is firing off on all cylinders, and I'm maybe for a split second, really unsure of what to do. But it was almost as if my eyes, my mind, everything was synchronized to know what to do. My eyes immediately went to a chat that was on my screen, and his assistant's name popped up. And she's not someone I talk to very often. So even the fact that her name was in my view is kind of synchronistic.
Mm-hmm.
And so I immediately call her. She luckily answers the phone. She immediately alerts his wife and his daughter. They come into the frame. They try to resuscitate him, and unfortunately, he passed away. And so this was an extremely traumatic experience. And this is not my first time witnessing someone die. I witnessed my father die as well. But the other part of mindfulness, as I said earlier, is that you gain an ability to accept things as they are. So there are really two things that where mindfulness showed up in this situation. One, focus. It gave me the focus to know what to do, which is why it is offered in military environments and in high stress
Mm-hmm.
environments. It's offered to doctors and nurses, to those employers that have to work in high stress scenarios. We are seeing a rise of mindfulness teaching and training in those
Mm-hmm.
disciplines because of the benefit that it has to giving you greater focus. The second thing that allows you to do is to accept things as they are, right? And
Right.
accepting that, and this is where it gets a bit more spiritual as well. Accepting that death is a part of life, right? Death is not the end. It is actually the beginning, right? It is the beginning of the next cycle. Something has to die in order for something else to be reborn. That is the foundation of so much in our world, right? In our nature, even the idea of mushrooms and fungus. Fungus is
Mm-hmm.
something that many people are actually afraid of because it represents death. But without fungus, we don't have life. Fungus is the microorganism that actually breaks down the dead, right? So that
Right.
it can turn into nutrition for the soil so that new life can actually breed. And so being able to see it from that perspective and know that I didn't necessarily lose a boss, I gained a spiritual advisor. And when I tell
Right.
you this man's words, even his last words, I'm telling me you have to focus on the details. Do you know how often I hear those words as it relates to
Mm-hmm.
what I'm doing now as a business leader? That also was a catalyst for me taking a sabbatical from my corporate job, and really utilizing the courage to say, no, I am not okay. Like, I am not okay. And I know for a fact that I would have probably tried to go right back to work. I wouldn't have wanted to let my team down. I wouldn't have wanted to, let anyone down. I'm the strong mindfulness. I can do anything. I'm capable.
Right.
But the reality is that I needed a break, and I was thinking about taking a sabbatical anyway. And now I'm able to do so, in a way that really is about preserving and protecting my mental health because I experienced a traumatic event. And so I took a workplace sabbatical, which I'm still on right now. I returned to work in October. So by October, I would have been out of my out on sabbatical for about a year and 4 months. And so what a gift that is, right? What a gift that this traumatic experience gave me, and even the ability to see the polarity and the duality of life. This person died, and I got to witness and be in his presence at the last moments of his life. And this is someone, he's like a walking Black history fact. I mean, his funeral was
Right.
full of people that, would have absolutely wanted to be there for him in his last moments. And I was selected to be there. And then the
Wow.
fact to see him surrounded by three other Black women, his daughter, his wife, and his Black female assistant, and me, right? What a lesson in how living a life full of service to others, because that's how he lived his life. What a lesson in how that brings you, right, an ending where you are actually surrounded by love and not alone. He could have been alone. He could have been in a meeting with people, with strangers. He could have been in a meeting with no one that had the compassion or the focus to know who to call, and or maybe just not the information to know who to call to
Right.
be able to help him in that moment. But he was in a meeting with me, and that meeting wasn't even supposed to take place at that day. It was supposed to be the next day, but I actually
Right.
moved it to that time, right? So, again, mindfulness is one of those tools that I did not know it at the time, but I have been preparing for this moment, I guess, my whole life, right? And witnessing my father pass away, and doing this work for the better of a year and a half or so. I have been preparing for this moment without knowing, and I was perfectly time suited, and it was the right divine timing for me to be there in his last moments. His legacy lives on, and he is still a part of my life every single day.
Wonderful. So I want to close out by asking you, because you've been so inspirational to the people who've listened, what's one sentence or word or book or mantra or something that really has had the most effect on you that you'd want to share with others?
Yeah. Obviously, I'll plug my honor the pause again, because that is one, and I
Mhm.
give it to anyone. Please use that when you feel you need a pause. If you need a sort of a catchy phrase, or write it
Mhm.
down, put it, post it on your wall. But another one is, early in my journey, one of the first books that I read on the topic of mindfulness is actually a book called Mindfulness in Plain English. And I just
Mhm.
mentioned this book a couple of days ago, so I've been wanting to reread it. But one of the first things that I recall reading where it was just such a huge aha moment was, the author of the book, and I can't remember his name, but he says many people
We'll
try to
find it and
answer
we'll put it in the show notes, though,
yeah,
by the way. So we will look for it and find it and put it in the
okay,
show notes
wonderful.
with a link.
Mindfulness in Plain English is the book. And early in the book, he says that many people ask the question, why do we meditate? And when they ask that question, they usually give the byproducts. They say you meditate because you want to reduce stress, or you want to get closer to God, or you want to be in the present moment. They give all the byproducts. And he said, from his perspective, that's not why we meditate. We meditate because we're human. And to be human is to experience suffering. And meditation is a tool. Again, he didn't use this word, but it's a tool that is a risk management tool for your suffering. And
Mhm.
so that something about the way, that was presented, it was very profound.
Mhm. Mhm.
Again, it neutralized it. It helped me understand. If he's saying this is a book from a more spiritual Buddhist tradition, although it is called
Mhm.
Mindfulness in Plain English, it is very much rooted, with unapologetically in Buddhist and Hindu beliefs. But when he says it that way, we meditate because we're a human. Again, going back to your prior question, meditation is not owned by one culture. Mindfulness and
Right.
meditation, prayer, being in the present moment are practices and ideologies and rituals and ways of being that have existed since the beginning of time in all faiths, right? In all cultures and all indigenous people, because that was their means of survival as humans. And so I encourage people to perhaps see it that way. Understand
Mhm.
that you can sort of democratize this topic and neutralize it for your own personal life. Whether you're a man, sometimes men think that mindfulness doesn't belong to them because they see it as a wellness self-care thing that is only for
Right.
women. But all of the sharpest, brilliant minds, and I listen to a lot of podcasts from billionaires and thought leaders, and they almost always mention meditation as a part of their lifestyle habit. It may not be the focus of their conversation, but it almost always
Right.
comes up because they understand that in order for you to be your best, you need to practice being still. And the only way
Yes.
that we can develop, you can learn. This was also in the book. take all my words with a grain of salt. And the same here. Take my words, Marcia's words with a grain of salt. The only way that you can learn mindfulness is through experience. It must be experienced and it must be practiced, because those are the practice is how we get better at things.
Excellent. Well, we're going to put it in the show notes, but in case people are listening as they're doing their laundry or driving their car, how can people get in touch with you? How can they work with you?
Yeah, you can follow me on social media. My Instagram and my TikTok is Shawnta, SHAWNTA underscore the underscore speaker. My website is mindfulculturecreators.com. There's a link to join my free community. I actually have a free community called the Mindful Mirror, where I offer free programming every month. And we did an event with a local musician in March, where she's a flutist, and she actually played the live flute while I recited one of
Oh,
my
beautiful.
mindfulness practices. So I'm doing some really cool events to really, again, democratize mindfulness and meditation for everyday people, so that they see themselves in this. They see that it belongs to them because they are human. And if you kind of vibe with my vibe, then check me out, join my community, and continue to learn how to be a better human through mindfulness.
Excellent. So thanks so much, Shantae. We're going to put all of that in the show notes. And I look forward to continuing to follow you, to continuing to watch your wonderful posts on Instagram. She is Shantae the speaker, as you can tell. She likes to speak. So please reach out to her if you're trying to have an event, and especially if you're looking for people who may have a different lens, right? The risk management of mindfulness, the mindfulness of people of color. There's so many different niches that you fit in, and it's important that people see that mindfulness is for everyone. So thanks again, Shantae. It was great having you here. And if you like this episode, make sure you subscribe, share it with other people, and I'll see you on the next episode. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us. Stay tuned for the next episode. If you like what you heard, subscribe and share it with others.